My name is Ethan Carter, and I was born in a small town in the United States in the mid-90s. From the very beginning, life didn't make things easy. My family wasn't poor in the extreme sense, but we were far from wealthy. Every dollar mattered, every decision had a weight, and every day was a subtle battle to keep things afloat. I still remember the evenings when my parents would sit at the kitchen table, quietly reviewing bills and trying to figure out how to cover rent, groceries, and other essentials. As a kid, I didn't fully grasp all the numbers and calculations, but I could feel the tension in the room. I could see the worry in my parents' eyes, the way they would put off certain expenses just to ensure we had the necessities. Growing up in that environment instilled in me a unique perspective on money and survival. While other kids dreamed of video games, vacations, or the latest gadgets, I often found myself thinking about the next week, the next meal, or how we could stretch our resources just a little further. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't exciting, but it was real. And that reality, as harsh as it felt, became the foundation of my mindset. I learned early that life doesn't hand you opportunities. You have to create them, you have to fight for them, and you have to persist even when it feels impossible. School didn't make things any easier. While my classmates talked about college parties or their weekend plans, I found myself observing patterns. I noticed how many adults around me were stuck in repetitive routines, working jobs they didn't enjoy, living paycheck to paycheck. I started to question everything. How could following the traditional path lead to a better life? If everyone is doing the same thing and struggling, what would make me different? I couldn't ignore this question because it started to define how I viewed the world. At home, we didn't talk about entrepreneurship or starting a business. Success stories in my town often came with luck or inheritance, not effort. I didn't have mentors or guides who could show me the way. My only role models were my parents, who, despite their hard work, were constrained by circumstance. Watching them, I realized that hard work alone wasn't enough. It might keep you afloat, but it wouldn't create freedom or financial independence. That understanding hit me hard, but it also sparked something else, a hunger, a desire to be different, to break the cycle. By the time I was a teenager, I had made a silent promise to myself. I didn't know how I would do it or when I would start, but I knew I couldn't settle for a life defined by limitations. I began paying attention to every opportunity, every person who seemed to have figured something out, and every skill I could learn. I started saving every bit of money I earned from odd jobs, mowing lawns, delivering newspapers, babysitting. Each small dollar felt significant because it represented independence, choice, and a step closer to freedom. I also began noticing patterns in people's success that others overlooked. Most people were reactive. They waited for opportunities to knock. I realized early that proactive action would be my edge. If I wanted something, I couldn't wait for it. I had to create the conditions for it myself. This wasn't just a lesson in money, it was a lesson in life. Persistence, observation, and strategic action were becoming part of my DNA long before I even knew it. Another factor that shaped me was my awareness of risk and consequence. Growing up, mistakes had immediate and tangible effects. If a bill was late, it created stress at home. If a task at work was missed, it meant less money. These small experiences taught me that actions have consequences and that responsibility isn't optional. I internalized this early, and it would later become the backbone of my decision-making in business and entrepreneurship. Despite the hardships, there were moments of joy and inspiration. Watching movies, listening to stories of people who overcame adversity, and observing successful entrepreneurs online began to light a spark inside me. I realized that the gap between ordinary and extraordinary wasn't luck. It was mindset, strategy, and execution. And if I could adopt those habits, even in small ways, I could start to change my trajectory. By the end of my teenage years, my perspective had shifted completely. I no longer saw my environment as limiting. I saw it as a challenge. Every scarcity, every struggle, and every moment of pressure became fuel. I became obsessed with understanding money, opportunity, and value creation. I wasn't content with just surviving anymore. I wanted to thrive, to create freedom not just for myself, but for anyone I could influence along the way. This was the beginning of Ethan Carter's journey. A journey that started in a small town with little resources, a family that worked hard but struggled, and a young boy who refused to accept the limitations of his circumstances. Everything that came later, the jobs, the failures, the experiments, the breakthroughs, all trace back to this foundation. The reality I grew up in wasn't easy, but it taught me resilience, observation, and most importantly, the hunger to build something lasting. And if you're watching this, I want you to understand one thing clearly. Your environment doesn't define your future. Your mindset does. Your choices do. And the lessons you learn from struggle can become the fuel for the life you want to create. That was my first step, and it's a step anyone can take. The moment you decide to see opportunity where others see limitation, everything changes. That's the power of perspective, discipline, and a relentless drive to create your own path. I want you to imagine this: a small town, limited resources, a young teenager observing life, learning silently, and preparing mentally for a future no one could see. That was me, and that perspective, that mental framework, is what would carry me through the next decade of failures, experiments, and ultimately breakthroughs. I remember waking up early every morning, getting ready for school, and following the same routine like everyone else. On the surface, everything looked normal. I was just another student sitting in a classroom, listening to teachers, taking notes, preparing for exams. But internally, something didn't feel right. My name is Ethan Carter, and during those years, I started asking questions that most people around me weren't asking. Why am I learning this? At first, I ignored these thoughts. I told myself this is just how life works. You go to school, you get good grades, you go to college, and then you get a job. That's what everyone said. That's what everyone believed. But the more I observed, the more that belief started falling apart. I began noticing the people around me. Not just students, but adults too. Teachers, neighbors, people in my community. Many of them had followed that exact path. They did everything right. They went to school, got degrees, found jobs. And yet, most of them were still struggling. Living paycheck to paycheck. That's when a thought hit me hard. If this system is supposed to lead to success, why does it look like survival? That question stayed with me. In class, I started paying less attention to memorizing information and more attention to understanding reality. I wasn't trying to be rebellious. I wasn't trying to fail. I was trying to make sense of something that didn't add up. We were learning math, but no one was teaching us how money actually works. And that disconnect started to bother me more and more. I remember sitting in a classroom one day, looking around at everyone focused, on passing the next test, and I had this realization: most people are preparing for exams, not for life. That moment changed how I approached everything. I didn't drop out, I didn't quit, but mentally, I shifted. Instead of relying only on what school was teaching me, I started educating myself outside of it. I began searching for information, books, videos, online content, anything that could teach me real-world skills. I became curious about money, and the more I learned, the more I realized something powerful. The information that changes your life is rarely taught in classrooms. At the same time, I was still living in the same environment, still seeing my family work hard, still watching the same financial struggles play out, and that created a kind of internal pressure, because now I couldn't pretend I didn't see it. I knew what staying on the same path would lead to, and that awareness, it creates urgency. By the time I reached my later school years, I felt like I was living two different lives. One life inside the system, attending classes, following rules, doing what was expected, and another life outside the system, thinking differently, questioning everything, trying to figure out a better way. It wasn't easy. There were moments of confusion, doubt, even fear, because when you start thinking differently, you also start separating from the crowd, and that can feel uncomfortable. Your friends don't understand your mindset. But despite all that, I kept going, because deep down, I knew something had to change. I started paying attention to people who were actually successful, not just financially, but in terms of freedom. And one thing stood out: they didn't rely on traditional paths alone. They built skills. That's when I made a quiet decision. I wasn't going to depend on school to build my future.
I was going to use it as a base, but build my real education outside of it.
That decision didn't change my life overnight. There was no instant success, no sudden breakthrough. But it changed my direction. Instead of moving blindly, I started moving with intention. I began developing a mindset that focused on growth, not comfort. Learning, not memorizing. Execution, not just theory.
And that mindset became the foundation for everything that came next.
Looking back now, I don't regret going through that system. It taught me discipline, structure, and consistency. But I also understand its limitations. School can give you knowledge, but it won't give you financial freedom. That part, you have to build yourself. And if you're watching this right now, maybe you've had the same thoughts. Maybe you've questioned the path you're on. Maybe you've looked around and realized something doesn't add up. If that's you, you're not wrong. You're just aware, and awareness is the first step to change. For me, this was the phase where everything started shifting internally. No visible success yet, no big achievements, just a change in perspective. But sometimes, that's the most powerful change of all. Because once your mindset changes, your actions follow. And once your actions change, your life has no choice but to change with it. This wasn't the moment I became successful, but this was the moment I stopped being average. And that made all the difference. After everything I had started realizing during my school years, there came a point where thinking wasn't enough anymore. I needed to experience real life for myself, not just observe it from a distance. And that's exactly what happened when I got my first job. I still remember the feeling of earning my own money for the first time. It felt like freedom, at least in the beginning. I told myself, this is it. This is how life works. You work, you get paid, and slowly you build your future. For a moment, it all made sense. But that illusion didn't last long. The job itself wasn't anything special. Long hours, basic tasks, and a repetitive routine that never really changed. I was doing what I was told, following instructions, trying to prove that I could handle responsibility. And at first, I was proud of that. But over time, I started noticing things, not about the job itself, but about the people around me, people who had been there for years, doing the same work, living the same routine, earning almost the same money, day after day, week after week, year after year. And that's when something inside me shifted. Because I wasn't just working anymore. I was observing. I started asking myself questions again. Is this what my life is going to look like? Is this the end result of all the effort? Is this what people mean when they say stability? Because from where I was standing, it didn't look like stability. It looked like a trap, a cycle that most people enter and never escape. Wake up early, go to work, come back tired, wait for the weekend, and repeat. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself maybe this is temporary, maybe things get better later. But the more I paid attention, the clearer it became. This wasn't temporary for most people. This was permanent. And that realization hit me harder than anything else. There was one moment in particular that I'll never forget. I was at work, doing something simple, nothing unusual, but I looked around and saw someone who had been there for over a decade. Same position, same routine. And in that moment, I saw my future. Not the future I wanted, but the one I was slowly heading toward. And it scared me, because for the first time, I understood something most people realize too late. If you don't change your direction, your future will look exactly like your present, just with more time passed. That thought stayed with me. I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't go back to being comfortable with the idea of just working and hoping things would somehow change. That's when my mindset started shifting again, this time more aggressively. I stopped looking at my job as a long-term solution and started seeing it for what it really was, a temporary phase, a stepping stone, not a destination. At the same time, I was confused, because knowing you want something different is one thing, but knowing how to get there is something completely different. I didn't have a clear plan, I didn't have a mentor, I didn't even know where to start. All I had was one strong feeling: I cannot stay like this. And sometimes, that's enough. So I started using my time differently. Instead of just resting or wasting time, I began researching, learning, and exploring possibilities. I was searching for something, anything, that could give me a different path. I came across online work, small businesses, and side hustles. At first, it was confusing. Too much information, too many opinions, too many so-called experts. It would have been easy to quit right there. But instead of getting overwhelmed, I got curious, because for the first time I saw people making money in ways I had never been taught, not by working a job, but by creating something. That idea changed everything. Even though my external life stayed the same, I was still going to work every day. Internally, everything was shifting. I was no longer comfortable, and that discomfort became my fuel. I started thinking differently about time. Every hour began to feel valuable. Every moment that didn't move me forward felt like a loss, and that's when discipline started building naturally. Not because someone forced me, but because I finally had a reason. Of course, the doubts were still there. What if this doesn't work? What if I fail? What if I waste my time? But then I asked myself a better question. What happens if I don't try? And the answer was simple. Nothing changes. And to me, that was more dangerous than failure. Because failure gives you experience. Failure moves you forward. But staying the same gives you nothing. That's when I made a quiet commitment to myself. I didn't announce it. I didn't tell anyone. I just decided internally. I'm going to find a way out. No matter how long it takes. No matter how many times I fail. I'm not staying here. That job, that routine, that environment, it didn't break me. It woke me up. It showed me a future I didn't want and forced me to start building a different one. Looking back now, I'm actually grateful for that phase of my life, because without it, I might have stayed comfortable. And comfort is dangerous. It keeps you stuck without you even realizing it. That phase was uncomfortable, confusing, and uncertain, but it was necessary, because that's where the real journey began. Not when I made money, not when I became successful, but the moment I decided I refused to live an average life. That decision changed everything. And if you're in that phase right now, working a job, feeling stuck, questioning your future, understand this clearly. That feeling is not a weakness. It's a signal that you're meant for more. But the truth is, a signal alone changes nothing. What changes everything is what you do next. And if you're waiting for the perfect moment, let me be honest with you, it doesn't exist. There is no perfect time, no perfect plan, no moment where everything suddenly makes sense. The only thing that actually matters is the decision to start. Because the difference between people who stay stuck and people who change their lives is not talent, not luck, not background. It's action. Small, uncomfortable, consistent action. So wherever you are right now, whether you're working a job you don't like, feeling stuck, or just trying to figure things out, understand this: you're closer than you think. You don't need to have everything figured out. You just need to take the first step, then the next one, and then the next. Because once you start moving, everything begins to change. My name is Ethan Carter, and this was my story.
Now it's your turn to write yours.